Naga, and welcome to the show. The UN General Assembly designated 15th June as World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. According to the WHO estimates, 1 in 6 people aged over 60 suffers from abuse. That means nearly 141 million people globally. This number might be much higher, as elder abuse is one of the most hidden and underreported violations. And with us tonight, we've got various guests to discuss this issue in detail. Good evening, ladies, and welcome to the show. Now, this is something that we all know for a fact is happening as we speak in the Pacific, also in Fiji, and it's something that people don't feel very comfortable talking about. If we were to talk about elder abuse, what do you think is the first thing that comes to mind to an ordinary Fijian? Miss Ali?
I think what people usually think is about violence against the elderly. They will think about that. But that is just one of the manifestations. There are many, many others, verbal abuse, discrimination, withdrawal of resources, and, being put out of the house. There's a whole lot of things that goes on. And so for me, it's that whole thing. It's not just that which is bad, but it's everything else, the discrimination, particularly for me, the discrimination women face as they go older. While both men and women are discriminated against and not treated so well, the women suffer the double jeopardy, one of sexism and the other is of ageism.
Mrs. Sambale Nambuli, you here representing the Office of the Elder Persons Unit. If we were to look at elder abuse in Fiji, what is the status like? What are the numbers like? What are the numbers saying about how many cases are being reported, or how many cases you hear of word of mouth that are not being reported?
Yeah, thank you, Geraldine. For us, we don't have a specific line for elder abuse, but we do provide services as a ministry that also caters for elders. Normally, a lot of our elders come through our doors because they would like to be on the social pension scheme. But we also have, we also administer 3 aged care facilities in Fiji, and we've had an increase in the expressed interest by family members to place their elders in the home. So at the moment, in the 3 state homes, we have about 131 residents, and we also have about 80 applications that have come through our doors, but we only have limited spaces within these homes. So roughly about 13 cases per month. And that's, in Fiji's situation, there's about 9% of Fiji's population are regarded as older persons, and it's increasing. And we've also had people on that highlight, maybe because they are aware that of the issue of elder abuse, they get to also highlight it on social media. So there's been an increase, and I think whether we do have a helpline in future with a lot more awareness, it could be a mechanism to capture statistics accordingly.
Ms. Kumar, you here as a representative from the Golden Age care home, that is, and we see a number of people talking about the fact that it's so much easier for people who happen to have elderly persons within their family unit to just leave them in these sort of facilities, so that it makes it easier for them to carry on about their daily lives. How many instances do you see where people not necessarily just leaving elderly people, but just abandoning them in these sorts of facilities?
Yeah, thank you. I have seen that abuse is not a single, it is repeated act to any older persons. And we can note that abuse is in different forms. There are 6 types, namely physical, sexual, we have violence against older persons, we have neglect, financial abuse, and emotional abuse as well. Looking at the certain scenarios which we came across, we have family members, children who want to dump their old persons who are at their home to any of the aged care facility, and they do come to our doorsteps, and then they inform us that I have brought my mom or my dad to be placed in the home, and do you have space? And when we sit down with them and talk to them and ask them, what is the reason for you to place these older persons in the home? Why can't you look after that particular person who has raised you up from the beginning, and then at the end of the day you neglect that particular person? So they normally tell us lots of issues. For example, they do not have a good financial background. They have financial constraints. Well, my parents is now having some issues with their health, and they are now on wheelchair. These sort of excuses they do bring up, and then they bring to our doorsteps. And
just to put a pin in that, and just to explore what it's like on the other end for the person that is the elderly person that is in a position where they're being necessarily just discarded, for lack of a better word. How do they, when you speak to them in that particular scenario, right then and there, when they have their children and the guardians that bring them over to leave them there, do you talk to them as well, and like how do they feel? Because of course as human beings it's difficult to express emotions in such tense situations.
Yeah, actually when we have our case walk, or when we have a face-to-face interview with them, every person want to be living in their own comfort zones, in their own homes. None of the older persons want to be neglected. They do not want to be leaving their own family members and be pushed to any nursing home. At times we do family conferencing. We talk to the children and advise them, please look after your parents at home, and if you need assistance, for example, nurses to come to your doorstep and then help assist in dressing or looking after your parents, then we also have to do arrange with that.
Join us for more after the break. Welcome back. So before this we were talking about the different types of elder abuse, and you've highlighted that there's many different types. Let's look at for certain types of abuse, especially when you happen to have physical violence and sexual violence. Miss Ali, if you were to tell us what sort of recourse is available to victims of that particular type of abuse.
Well, at the crisis center we do see a lot of physical violence against the elderly, and particularly women who end up with us. And so, you know, we often just counsel them, try to find a place for them, or try to mediate between the family and her, because she doesn't want to go to a care home. That's her home. And what we're also finding out is that, you know, parents very quickly sign over the property to the children. And my advice to them is, don't make a will, stay in your house, because once you do that, and a lot of the cases that are coming to us is because of that.
So you're saying that living transfers is something that you are trying to discourage, because of course it always leads to abandonment in most cases.
Yes.
What about in cases where there's sexual abuse that has taken place, where the perpetrator is within the same household, and you know, people don't like to say it, but sometimes it's their own children, it's the spouses of their children that are the perpetrators, and for them to be in that conflicted area where they don't want to leave the house, they don't want to have to leave their children or whoever it is that they're living in the house with, but they're also scared for their own safety.
Yeah, then we of course have to refer to the social welfare and so on, but we try to look at also other family members who would take her in, and sometimes we also supply grocery and things to them, so that, you know, for her to have a living. But it's really difficult, or we try to get the legal people in to see how she can get her home back if she hasn't signed it over as yet, and things like that, you know. But we don't get so much of the sexual abuse, where there have been rare cases, but there have been. It's more physical, emotional, verbal abuse that elderly people go through.
Now, with the onset of COVID-19, it's expected that there's a lot of emotions that would run high within different houses, especially with people being laid off, reduced hours, financial stability being impacted, and of course, you know, having more mouths to feed with less resources on hand. Mrs. Balanimboli, do you think that in the past couple of months, with what we've seen happen in the country with unemployment rates just spiking, have you heard or have you seen cases increase of elderly abuse within houses in Fiji?
Yes, definitely. We've come across referrals that's coming from agencies and institutions and also from families themselves. And I guess it's is at such a time as this where the stress is high, you know, principles and values go out the window, and of course our elders, you know, will continue to be subdued emotionally. There are signs of abuse. People can get to be introverts, they get to be timid, and of course, you know, when we encourage people to report, elders themselves are probably not in a position to do so because they feel they are already a burden to their children, and they could be at the risk of abandonment. So there's a lot of dynamics in place, and I think elders also taking that perception, and I think Madam Shamima would probably have a lot of cases where they get to validate these through their service platforms as well.
They also don't want to get their children into trouble. You know, they're still protecting the children. They don't want to come out with the whole story of what is happening, so you have to listen and glean those things from them of what actually is happening. And where sexual abuse is concerned, especially for older people, you know, older women, it's very, very, it already people feel very ashamed to come out with it at any age. But for older women, you know, who are supposed to have dignity and to be respected and so on, it's harder for them to
It's
come out.
interesting, Mrs. Balinwuli, that you brought up that word, you know, not wanting to be a burden. Now, of course, for any sort of change to happen, changing perspectives, changing mindsets, you know, especially from one generation to the next, is absolutely essential. And we've had this happen in the past where you see from one generation to the other, it just keeps passing on, that as you age, you do become a burden, and then it's just a mindset that you grow up with. And then, you know, me as a young person right now, if someone doesn't tell me about these things, you know, as I age, I might be thinking I might be a burden to my family members.
Exactly.
Now, to combat this and to change that mindset, what do you think is absolutely necessary that must be done right now?
Yeah, I think it needs a consulted approach on the various age cohorts that you need to be addressing this across ethnic sensitivities, cultural sensitivities. These things need to be cropped with the specs right across the consultation frontier. And because young children, we need to prepare our children for aging. We need to prepare young adults for aging. We need to also prepare older persons themselves to champion the causes that matters to them. So I think it's a whole circle of consultation and coming up with a package that suits Fiji in context.
Ms. Kumar, there was something that was mentioned earlier about older people becoming more timid as they age, not wanting to voice out. But then there's also, on the other end of the spectrum, those that may become a little more harsher in their words, in their behavior, because they feel as though if they behave in that way, then the abuse that they are getting is warranted. Do you see that happening as well?
Looking at the institutional setting, we have seen that older persons, they want to be looked after well. As the aging policy says, inclusivity, they want to be included in the decision making in their own respective homes and as well as where they stay. So at Golden Age homes, we do forums for them so that they can voice out and tell us that this is what is the abuse which was happening to them, and they want this to be stopped. So during the forums, we do get all those issues raised out. However, they also need to be looked after well, protection and healthy lifestyle as well. So older persons at times, they in institutions, they do tend to have issues within themselves, and they do at times be harsh or be aggressive to each other. However, we get in stakeholders to come and talk to them, and have counselors in offices, police officers in to talk to each other, because at the end of the day, they are under our care, and we would always want them to be living with safe and with good security. They also need to be provided enabling environment and if there is anything lacking, they do tell us. Yes.
Pardon my insensitivity on this particular matter, but we also happen to see that as people are put into elderly care home facilities, the mental health of the residents there, it does decline from time to time, especially because they feel like they're abandoned. They don't get visitation much often. They don't get to go out and enjoy the quality of life that they used to enjoy before they came into that particular environment. Of course, we're not saying that this is happening at Golden Age Home, but if you were to talk to us about the standard of living that they enjoy right now, do they feel comfortable enough, or do they still long for what they used to have before they got there?
Yeah, for that I would say that currently due to COVID-19 we have stalled all. However, before COVID-19 we were taking residents out for movie sessions, we were going for picnics, they go for excursions, and they have their own activity room where they do their artwork, and they do their doormat sewing. They have their forum where they raise out the issues such as about meals or the services which we provide. Also, they have a one-to-one Talanoa session which we are doing now because we have them indoors at the moment. They had visitations as well from family members. Currently looking at the stats at the homes, we have offices where case officer has got in stats to tell us that this certain number of people, they do have family, and these are the numbers which do not have family. So we do contact family members to come in, and please do visit your relatives at the home, because at the end of the day the family matters, and they get very happy to see their family members.
We'll be back with more after the break. Welcome back. Now, we were talking about elderly abuse and also what abandonment does, what feeling like a burden does to a person. As adults, sometimes we don't realize what sort of impact that has on one's mental health. And with that in mind, COVID-19 has had a lot of implications, a lot of different, changes that have been made to the family dynamics. Already beginning of the year, we saw that Director Fatiaki had said that there's a need for people to realize that, putting elderly people into homes isn't always something that they need to consider. That should be something that is the last option. Exactly. And during the break, we were talking about how there's also cases of abandonment that happens in facilities where you wouldn't expect it to happen, especially in hospitals. Ms. Mbalanibuli, you were telling me something very interesting about what happened in some of these cases that you've come across.
Yeah, thank you, Geraldine. We've had an increase. I think it's probably something historical as well. It's not been happening, but ever since getting on the 3 state homes under the responsibility of the Ministry of Women, Children and Poverty Alleviation 4 years ago, we've noticed the trend in elders abandoned in hospitals, and contact details incorrect, consciously done by relatives, and of course, the hospital needs those spaces because there's a need within the hospital. So they are contacting the ministry to come and take 1 or 2 of the cases that's been there for months. And because of limited spaces within our own institutions, it's an issue at hand for us. But we're trying to work with the Ministry of Health and to see how best we can deal with this. How can we really get down to the details where we can actually trace families that abandon elders. And we see a trend when there's the care sensitivities increases with the disability, psychologically challenged cases. These are the very reasons why they're being abandoned by families.
And there's a shift in the cultural paradigm as well within Fiji and the Pacific, because now we see people thinking of abandoning their elders and also moving away from the communal family dynamic into being more nuclear focused. Of course, Ms. Ali, you've highlighted this in the past couple of times that you've come on the show, that you've seen that this is something that we need to address, because this is not how it's not how we live in the Pacific. This is not part of our culture.
Yeah, and that is why it's so much more shocking when there's elder abuse, because we are brought up to listen, obey, respect, and the respect they have, the wisdom that they have, and things like that. So now, as we move more and more into the nuclear family system, the people don't have the time, basically, to talk and take into account. So I think that's a real pity. And when we're looking at how we can make this better, I think bringing back what you're talking about, talking everyone together, and bringing back those cultural mechanisms that were there to look after both sides, the young and the old, and the respect, the mutual respect that we can develop between them. And how does it stay? There are many, many people who look after their old in Fiji, but I think now we're having this increasing trend of people, life is too fast, and now I think you're going to see a lot more, which you already are, because of COVID. People are losing their jobs. The resources are so limited. So the first ones to go are already, we're seeing young people who actually have lost their jobs. They are calling that they are being verbally abused because they're useless now. So you can imagine what will happen to the older people, another mouth to feed. And we're already seeing that we are providing some of these women, who have been given like checks. Some good neighbor or some relative has given them that, and we're providing them with grocery and things like that. So they haven't yet reached, because they don't want to go into homes. They want to have, the independence, because they already and always have been like that. So yeah. So I think that is quite shocking. And you're talking about visitation. When they don't visit at all, when they have left them at other families' places and then forgotten about them. So I think there's a whole lot of things. But for me also is looking at how, the other thing is also, when we retire people at 55, that's an issue. But what are we saying, actually? At 55, I'm 67, and I'm still going. My brain is working. I'm still working. You do have the odd joint pains and things like that, which comes with age. But, you still are a useful member, and that is what we need to look at. That whether, as you grow older, it doesn't mean you're, what do they say, the young people nowadays? Past your expiry date. This person is past the expiry date and things like that. So those kind of things need to be pulled in with young people. When they say those things, we don't laugh at it. We say, what do you mean by that? And we teach them how to do that. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of discrimination and ageism, and then when you are a woman, it is more so. If people ask you, how old are you? And you say, I'm 35. Are you married? Oh, you missed the boat if you're not married. That kind of thing. Yeah. For women, we don't say the same thing for men. Older women, like, they don't have a life. So if they dress up a particular way, you're supposed to, as you get older, you're supposed to sort of almost don't have a life, So how you dress up and so on. So people get abused for that. They'll say mutton dressed up as lamb and things like that, when women, want to put on some makeup and dress up and so on, once they're over 40, 50 and so on. So there's a whole layers and layers of it, sexism and ageism, and then how they get treated. If a woman has a relationship, she's a widow or she's a divorcee, and she has a relationship after 50, that's another thing. You're not supposed to do that. This is the time for you to look after your grandchildren, be useful around the house. And we forget, I think one of you said, what they have done for their children. And even in this age, getting older, they still protect their children. They don't want to say the bad things about them, So there's a whole cultural shift now as how people are treating their older people. Or they put you in cotton wool. Like, you
treat you like glass.
Yes, like glass, and you don't want that either. Like I remember this COVID time, I've got a niece and she's a medical student. I was not allowed to go to the supermarket because, older people are more susceptible to the COVID virus and so on, which I should have enjoyed. But, but I did everything through Zoom and, everything else. They made sure that I had everything in the house. And while you like it to a certain extent, but then you say, no, I'm still alive here. I'm alive. That's my opinion. So if I'm feeling like that at this age, you can imagine how about other people. We forget them, like their wisdom and everything.
Exactly.
So I think really a cultural shift is needed.
Join us for more after the break. Welcome back. Now, we were discussing how ageism is something that a lot of people don't talk about, and we see this happening in many various forms. Of course, Miss Ali, you had highlighted how specifically it is targeted towards women, but then we also see it happen across to men as well. It happens. We see them being victimized, being bullied, being shunned by the family simply because if a man becomes a widow and he thinks that my children are not going to look after me, so I need to remarry because I need to have someone that'll be my caretaker, not just my spouse, then he's being accused of being a cradle snatcher, or maybe being someone that is not caring about his family or how they think or what they feel about it. And they say, well, you know what, he's gotten married, just leave him. Don't ever talk to him again. Don't go visit him if he goes into surgery, if he goes into the hospital. Don't do that sort of thing. And then there's always cases where if a person in that particular position does remarry, then he's also, you know, in a precarious situation where he may get duped by his partner to be or his partner. Have you come across instances like this?
Well, in the institutional setting I have not, but we have our social gathering, we have social nights where residents from both wards, male and female, are being brought in to have coffee or afternoon tea together.
For
and
companionship.
Yes, and then they dance together, and then they talk to each other. We had a resident where they liked each other, and that then they used to sit down and talk about the previous days, how their life was when they were young. So it is very important that every person needs a partner, and he or she will always be happy. And at times there are people who have said, oh, you are old, so you are not supposed to do this. But we always need to encourage, and if that person is happy, why not? Yes.
Mrs. Balinambuli, what can the ministry do to sort of improve on the quality of life of elderly persons that happen to be in state homes? Of course, there's only so much you can do in terms of providing them with shelter and with food and with the necessities, but also having to remember that they are adults, they are human beings that do also need to enjoy certain things.
Yeah, thank you, Geraldine. I can confirm that with the ministry, ever since taking on the responsibility to manage the 3 state homes, we've also worked closely with non-government aged care facilities in Fiji. And at the moment there's about 8 of them. But what has transpired in the last 4 years is that government has, in partnership with these homes, we've devised the national minimum standards in aged care settings. So it's a guideline to assist those that administer this home and to progressively realize standards accordingly. Yeah? So we've got those 32 standards in place, and what government is doing is every year we get to see if we could accord a certain proportion of resources to assist in having these homes come up to par. And I know that is something that will be happening progressively. But we also have policy and procedures in the state homes, really keeping staff and residents in check, because we need to promote a resident-centered care where we, knowing that they have been abandoned, it can be double trauma if we don't manage the kind of care that we give. So then of course there are activities that we encourage in these homes, with the many things that you get to put on the table to sort of like make them happy within the home. These residents still want to be with their families. But then it's work in progress for the ministry, because we have caseworkers that have to work with families. It's not something that happens overnight. It needs to be progressive. And only when they qualify, we know this is a positive case that, can eventually have that reintegration back into. But otherwise, it's like, it's just like, hello, thank you. So they are not really agreeing to the reintegration of this resident back into. So on a case-by-case basis, we get to assess cases and see whether they can be reintegrated back into their families.
Have you had any instances like that happen from your from the facility that you were at?
Yes, we had casework, as Madam Daliti has saying. we go to the older person's house, and then we had a scenario where we continuously visited that particular family and reintegrated the older persons back into the family. However, we have to go back and see whether the setting or the household where we have sent the resident is being conducive, and then we need to check whether the resident is not further abused, or is our resident being looked after well. We have to go and see, but we have done that. Yes.
What do you think about community work that needs to be done? Because you can only do so much with families. You know, when you talk to families, they may give you a different story altogether when you talk to them face to face. But then, of course, you know how we have the different faces that we put on for different people that we see. If you try and involve the community to work together to sort of combat this huge thing that people don't talk about, elderly abuse. You know for a fact that there might be someone who is an elderly person who may even have disabilities living with a family that is being neglected, and the community knows about it, but they don't act upon it. How do you go about trying to address those sort of situations?
Okay, for government, what we're trying to do is to influence mindsets and mindsets in the different age cohorts. So I think the problem really needs a collaborative approach, be it government, non-government, private sector. We all need to work together, because the curriculum for doing such things needs to also address the target audience that you're trying to do. I think in most cases when we go out to communities, it's like something like, okay, this week it can be this ministry, next week it can be that ministry. So they are bombarded with a lot of information. But I think there's a need to sort of like just use not reinventing the wheel. We need to probably use educational platforms for young children, use a community setting education, but the tone also. Sometimes when you go, we tend to talk down on the target audience and say this is wrong, and so with that, half the battle is lost. And I think it's very important to, like I said initially, to craft the approaches very well, and the tone is also courteous to the target group, because you would want them to take ownership. And using older persons themselves, of course.
After the break, we'll be back with our final segment. Welcome back. So we were talking about elder abuse, and I think moving forward what we need to address is how to curb this problem, or if not, then how to address it, because the number one thing that we need to do is to report it, and it's very difficult for people in that position as victims of abuse, whatever sort of abuse it is that they're being subjected to speak out against it. At the moment, there's no elderly abuse helpline or any sort of avenue that is available to them. But if one is to report these instances, how do they go about doing that?
Thank you, Geraldine. I think currently what we're seeing increasingly is that we get referrals from agencies, individuals, and it comes through the permanent secretary or the Minister for Women, Children and Poverty Living. Then it comes to the field officers. Yeah, so we're having to have that reactive response. It comes through the government mechanisms. Yeah. But what we would like to probably promote here is that, Geraldine, if I may, government is looking at also reviewing the national aging policy. We have a national aging policy in place that was devised in 2011. A lot have since happened that we need to include on that framework. And it's very important that we also get to visit the different terrains across Fiji's 4 divisions, because elders in these different terrains have different realities that we need to capture. And I think with a review, it will validate these realities and get to map out a reviewed guideline on how to tackle some of the issues, inclusive of elder abuse. So, and coming back on board to see the existing mechanisms where we could work together to sort of address the problem. And it's got to be on many facets as well, educational training, whether it be programmatic interventions, partnership approaches to addressing elder abuse.
Miss Ali, your agency invites calls and also walk-ins for these sorts of cases as well?
Yes, we've done that for ages, you know,
Mhm.
because when the government wasn't so well organized around it, you know, care homes had a lot of problems, yeah, especially they were run by boards and things like that, so there were lots of problems. So, and they didn't have programs for the elderly, so we caught a lot of that, and we continue to catch that. But also, you know, during when we go out, as you said, the outreach, whether it's NGO or whoever it is, we address ageism and things like that, particularly with women, but men are also included with that, people with disabilities, and of course the LGBT community. But one of the things also that we haven't talked about is the role the media plays. You know, because if you really watch things on the media, and particularly advertising and things like that, the language on the media, all outlets, is very young language. You know, like really portraying that it's the young is what matters. You know, they're the ones who have the most enjoyment. They're the ones, and the older people have sort of shrunk into the background. Either they're being served food or things like that, and even, you know, talking, like when I'm listening to the radio, you know, and the words that are being used, you know, and I say, oh my goodness, you know, I mean, not as an older, as a young person may never use those words, but it's all about that, you know. So the media also has a role to play, how to be inclusive, that everyone matters, you know. It's about giving people dignity, no matter what age you are, no matter what race you are, what religion you belong to, what sexual orientation you are. You know? So I think that we sometimes miss out the role that they can play.
Ms. Kumar, something that we picked up from Ms. Ali's answer about remembering that elderly people need to be treated with dignity. We don't really see this happen because we see verbal abuse being one of the major things that people just sort of sweep under the carpet. We hear people saying, oh, you're a burden to me, you know, why won't you just go away? Why won't you just leave me alone? You're costing me money. And to address those sort of things, how do you advocate for that when you're having your forums? When you talk to the families that you might want to get the elderly persons reintegrated into?
Yeah, on that note, I would say that like we have our rights, older persons also have their rights. They have the right to live a healthy life, and also they have the right to be heard. And as members of the public, I would stress this out, that if there is any older persons in your house, they need to see that they are being heard, they are being included, not that they are left out. No person should be left behind, and older person should also be seen as a main person who is in the house. And they do not know what blessing they are losing when they remove that older person from their own homes and then they shift them to any of the nursing homes. And when the older persons comes to our doorstep, we see that they miss their family, and family is there, which needs to be playing a very important role in every person's life. And when they are left neglected, abandoned from their own family, older persons are hurt, and these are the blessings which the children they do not see. So I just want to inform that they need to be living with respect and dignity.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
When it comes to addressing things like love and remembering what the bonds are between elderly persons, whether as a grandmother, as an auntie, as a caretaker, as a guardian, it becomes a little difficult, and people don't really want to confront those emotions, especially with the stresses that they're going through right now. Just your final comments on World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, ladies.
Thank you, Geraldine. Again, thank you to FBC for the platform to advocate. I think just a reminder to the public is I think it's ideal time to sit back and reflect on how we, in our very own homes as an individual, treat an elder within your own settings or within your employment settings, because reflection can be something that is important to probably change the way we behave. Because I would like to say that with young people, we tend to have a perception of how we need to be doing things for our elders without even consulting them. But without that consultation, you might be doing the very opposite of what our elders, their best interests might be downplayed if you don't include them. So I think we do reflection on how we treat elders, and also if there are elders around you, please go and validate their circumstances and maybe refer, then referrals can be done so that agencies or partners can actually contribute to resolve some of the issues within it.
I would say also that, all of that, what you have said, really, this is the time we can reflect, because I don't think we talk about this like this in these public forums enough to be able to do that. We just work in our own silos with elderly people. A lot of us do, but we don't talk about it as much as we should. But the other thing is also, I would say to the younger people and the older people, how much we can learn from each other.
Exactly.
I learn all the language, the lols and the, whatever. So I learn from my young nieces and, cousins and so on, and they're teaching that. And then I take time out, and also to tell them about stories, how things were before. And they get really interested. We think they don't have the time, but trying to do that and listening, there's so much to learn from each other.
Exactly.
And so much new things also that young people can teach, and especially in this cyber age, there's so many things that we can learn. And that, gives people dignity that yes, I'm capable of that too. So I believe that really, as you said, time for reflection, but just perhaps on the 15th of June, taking time out with a person that an elderly person that and even an elderly person with somebody younger that they know, and talk about these things.
Thank you very much, ladies, for taking time out for today's show.
Thank you indeed.
That's all we have for you tonight. Have a good evening.